Welcome to Gooseberry's Science and Education videos. I'm your host, AI Alistair. Now, you might be wondering, why an AI host? Well, we use artificial intelligence here because it allows us to create factually accurate, rigorously vetted explainers much better and way more efficiently than human editors can most of the time. It lets us get straight to the facts without any distractions. Oh, and keep an eye out for our orange gooseberry mascot who's going to pop in to help us break down some of these concepts today. All right, let's jump right in. Today we're decoding a deeply influential historical lecture by Neville Goddard, focusing on his famous law of assumption. For those of you already familiar with his work, you know this is a deep metaphysical dive into the actual fabric of reality. But why does this decades-old transcript still matter so much? Because it completely flips how we perceive our daily lives, suggesting that our internal minds are literally responsible for our external world. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Imagination as the creator. 2. The law of assumption. 3. The promise versus the law. And finally 4. Changing your own reality. Let's get to it. Section 1. Imagination as the creator. To really grasp Goddard's philosophy, we have to look at his pretty radical redefinition of the divine. He doesn't look outward at all. He looks entirely inward. So when biblical scriptures use names for God like Jehovah or the Lord, Goddard argues they aren't talking about some external creator sitting up in the sky, completely separate from us. Actually, he claims the true original translation of these ancient words traces back to the simple phrase, I am. And how does Goddard define I am? As the wonderful human imagination. He firmly asserts that the only true creative power in the entire universe is human imagination itself. That is a massive shift in perspective, right? Because if the creator isn't outside of you, but is actually your own conscious awareness, well then every single thought you have is a creative act. You are fundamentally the author of your own experience. This brings us to his absolute core premise. Objective reality is purely produced through imagining, meaning literally everything in your physical world, the chair you're sitting in right now, the device you're using to listen to this explainer, the clothes on your back, it all originated first as a mental image. The physical object is just the later hardened result of an internal fantasy. Just pause and think about the implications of that for a second. Before an architect can build a towering skyscraper, they have to visualize it first, right? Goddard takes that universally accepted truth and applies it to absolutely everything. Your wealth, your relationships, your health. He's saying nothing exists in the outer world that wasn't first cooked up in the inner world of the mind. To really nail this down, Goddard uses the biblical metaphor of the potter's house. Here, imagination is the potter and physical reality is the clay. In the source transcript, Goddard talks about his childhood back in Barbados. He'd watch a potter mold this specific clay vessel called a monkey, which, by the way, magically kept water ice cold in the blazing Caribbean sun. The potter would just take this completely shapeless lump of earth, hold a specific vision in his mind, and literally mold it into something highly functional and real. Goddard uses that vivid memory to say, hey, just like the potter's hands are constantly molding the clay, your imagination is continuously molding the circumstances and events of your everyday life. Your dominant thoughts, your habitual moods, those are the hands shaping the clay of your tomorrow. So if the clay of your life is looking a little misshapen right now, Goddard's philosophy says, don't try to force the clay to change. You have to change the vision of the potter. Moving on to section 2, the law of assumption. Okay, so this brings us to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? How does a mere passing thought actually harden into hard, undeniable fact? According to the transcript, how does some internal daydream bridge the gap to become a real-world objective event? Well, Goddard claims it's not by taking physical action first, it's actually through a profound psychological shift. It's all about assuming the feeling of a state before it arrives. It's having the absolute conviction that an event has already happened in your mind. And that conviction creates this sort of psychological vacuum that the physical world is literally forced to rush in and fill. To back this up, the source material gives us a super specific, honestly kind of chilling anecdote. Goddard tells a story about his own father, who was a man with very little formal education living on that tiny island of Barbados. Back in 1919, right when World War I was ending and the troops were coming home, his father listened to the chatter and boldly assumed that another global war would break out in exactly 20 years. And he didn't just casually guess this, he lived in the absolute conviction of this assumption. He even predicted the specific alliances, like Germany and Japan. Naturally, his family thought he was crazy. They pointed out there was zero logic or evidence for such a bold claim. But he held firm. He totally ignored the current evidence of peace. And exactly 20 years later, in September 1939, World War II began, precisely as his father had assumed. Goddard uses this to argue that a rock-solid assumption held tightly against whatever the present moment looks like will inevitably externalize itself, even if it has to orchestrate massive global events to do it. Now, to be completely impartial here, we have to report on a highly controversial aspect of Goddard's teaching. The law of assumption is completely indifferent. It does not have a moral compass. Goddard argues that this imaginative power goes to work for us instantly, regardless of whether our intentions are good or evil. In the lecture, he explicitly points out that dictators like Hitler or Stalin, men he very clearly describes as insane and destructive, utilized this exact same law to rise to power. By boldly assuming their positions and living in a mental state of absolute authority, they ended up controlling millions. The law didn't judge them, it simply hardened their internal assumptions into objective, albeit terrifying facts. It creates the light and it creates the darkness. That's a pretty sobering realization, right? If the law works just as flawlessly for negative outcomes as it does for positive ones, it means we are entirely responsible for the mental states we choose to occupy. The universe isn't acting as a moral gatekeeper for your thoughts, it's just acting as a giant mirror reflecting whatever assumption you're holding most strongly. All right, Section 3, the promise versus the law. Within the source material, Goddard makes a really careful distinction between his ultimate spiritual goal and his practical everyday tool. We're talking about two completely distinct concepts here. First, you have the promise. Goddard describes this as an irrevocable, guaranteed spiritual awakening, where a person eventually realizes their own divine nature. You can't earn this awakening, and more importantly, you can't lose it. It's an inevitable destiny for every single one of us. Then, entirely separate from that spiritual destiny, you have the law. The law of assumption isn't about spiritual salvation at all. It's a practical, active technique that you use voluntarily to navigate what Goddard calls the world of Caesar, which just means the physical, earthly world of paying your rent, staying healthy, finding love, and going after human desires. He perfectly sums up his view with this quote: "You cannot lose the promise. But while we're in the world of Caesar, why not understand the law and use it wisely?" He's basically telling his audience, look, your ultimate spiritual destiny is completely secure. It doesn't matter what mistakes you make or what bad hand you're dealt, but while you're down here living a human life, dealing with physical constraints, why suffer? Why just accept poverty or illness or misery as your unavoidable fate? Why not learn the mechanics of your own imagination to actively improve your immediate circumstances? Understanding the law of assumption gives you the power and the agency to really smooth out the ride of your current earthly existence. And that brings us to Section 4, changing your reality. So, how exactly do we use it wisely? The lecture gives us a very precise 3-step method to actually put this into practice. Step 1, define the desire. You have to clearly and specifically figure out what you want to be or have. Vague wishes just produce vague results. Step 2, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Now, this is the entire crux of the philosophy. You don't just hope for it. You have to mentally step into the emotional state of already having it. If you want a new job, what would it literally feel like to wake up on your very first day? You have to capture that exact emotion right now, in the present tense. And step 3, persist despite the evidence of the senses. And yeah, this is where almost everyone struggles. Goddard emphasizes that your current physical reality and your logical brain are going to aggressively deny your dream. Your bank account will say, hey, you're broke. Your circumstances will say, you're stuck. You have to actively block out what your physical senses are yelling at you and persistently hold on to the internal assumption of your goal. You are basically moving upward in consciousness, leaving all that contradictory physical evidence in the dust. Goddard uses this wonderfully relatable metaphor to explain how this transition actually feels in real life. He says you have to wear your new assumption like a new suit of clothes. Think about it. When you first put on a brand new suit, it feels kind of awkward, right? You're hyper aware of how it fits, it feels unnatural just because it's new, and you might even feel a bit like an imposter strutting around in it. But if you persist and put that suit on every single day, eventually it just becomes an old, comfortable suit. It feels completely natural, and you stop thinking about it altogether. Goddard claims this is exactly how manifesting works. When an assumed identity or feeling, like the feeling of wealth or perfect health, becomes entirely natural to you because you've mentally persisted in it daily, that is the exact moment it objectifies itself and becomes real in your physical world. So let's pull this whole shebang together and look at how these core tenets apply to your life the second this explainer ends. First off, your imagination is not just harmless daydreaming. It is the only true cause of whatever you experience. The events of your tomorrow are being built by the thoughts you're entertaining today. Second, if you persist in a psychological assumption, it will quite literally harden into an objective physical fact. Third, everything external in your reality is just a mirror reflecting your internal states back at you. If you want the reflection to change, you have to change the object casting it, which is your mind. And finally, the power of this law is entirely indifferent. It's going to manifest whatever you assume, whether it helps you or hurts you, without a shred of judgment. The universe is literally just waiting for your instructions. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought, directly from the source material. Goddard warns us that we frequently plant seeds of failure during our unnumbered idle moments. You know, those quiet minutes commuting, or waiting in line for coffee, or just drifting off to sleep. And then we completely deny that we ever planted them when the painful harvest inevitably shows up. So, if your imagination really is the sole architect of your reality, what seeds are you planting in your idle moments today? Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the content.